Sage Wanderer here, coming at you from my van down by the river. So today I wanted to talk about a grid down scenario in the United States of America. Don't. Why would something like that occur? What does it mean for something like that to occur? And what are the ramifications of something like that occurring? So, just to clarify, an EMP, or electromagnetic pulse, is a much more devastating thing that could occur than a grid down scenario. What's the difference? EMPs would destroy your car's computer and make it non-functioning, so you couldn't start your car even if you had a full tank of gas and a full battery. An EMP would destroy all of your devices, especially any of those that were plugged in at the time. Not to mention frying every single transformer and every single power station in the entire country. And this could happen from an EMP. So an EMP is a much more devastating thing than a grid down scenario. It's also much less likely than a grid down scenario. Why is a grid down scenario more likely? Why is it more likely that the power grid could fail than it would be to receive an EMP attack? Well, there's the logistics of delivering an EMP attack. That does require some sort of nuclear device or some variation of a nuclear device. Not everybody has that technology. Whereas we could take down our power grid could be taken down really, really easy. In one report, I have heard that it is possible to take down the entire United States power grid with less than 20 marksmen with average shooting skills and equipped with bolt-action rifles. So 20 deer hunters could get together and go, let's take down the power grid. That we're that vulnerable. There's been a few dry runs of this sort of attack. There was one in California, I believe, where a substation power distribution center was attacked by 3 or 4 riflemen. This was called by the press, it was called an act of vandalism. It was called vandalism. But it seemed clear to me that it was a dry run by a group of men who were seeing how difficult it would be to cripple a power station and how quickly they could do it and get away. So we're much more vulnerable to a grid down or power grid failure in America than we are an EMP. So although it'd be great to have electronics stowed away in Faraday cages in case of an EMP, it probably would behoove you first to prepare for a power grid failure, which could come from a cyber attack, which is what we're hearing lately. It could come from a cyber attack or a physical attack on transformers. Just this weekend, the New York Times put forth an article which has been denounced by Donald Trump and called fake news. But in this article, they come right out and say that the United States has been attacking the Russian power grid and trying to make their power grid fail through cyber attacks. Now, this was said to be untrue, and it may be that we are doing it and Donald Trump just doesn't know because it's the deep state doing it. I do know this, Russia is on the edge of doing it to us, because I think they have the technology to drop our power grid. How hard could it be? Just even short of an EMP, they could probably do it through a cyber attack. In fact, some believe that we have an off switch to the Russian power grid, and they have an off switch to the United States power grid, and sooner or later, somebody's going to flip the switch on the other one. A preemptive power grid attack. So, there's various ways, right down to sunspots causing an EMP, that could cause our power grid in the United States to fail. On an interesting side note, if you live in Texas, you are the only state that has its own independent power grid, which presumably would not fail if the rest of the power grid went down. And the reason that the power grid could even go down to begin with is because we no longer rely on individual power stations or individual hydroelectric dams or individual nuclear power plants. That all of our hydroelectric dams, all of our nuclear power plants, all of our coal-fired generators are all linked together and share electricity. So if one underperforms, it's made up by the other one. If another one overperforms, the electricity is shared amongst the other areas. This is true except for the isolated power grid of Texas. So if you live in Texas, your power grid could be taken down, and the rest of the country might not be taken down. So that's one of the bad things about being off the power grid in Texas, is that they could just take Texas out and the rest of the country could have their electricity. That's a little scary. But also, on the bright side, is that if they took out the rest of the entire nation and they didn't do specific things to Texas, Texas power grid would continue to function in the event of a national grid down scenario. So, what are some of the things that a grid down scenario would cause problems for the average person? You'd think, oh, well, so I don't have electricity. I've been through a power outage before. No big deal. Well, you've been through a local power outage before. You have not been through even a regional power outage, more than likely. And you have definitely not been through a national power outage, because that's never happened. So, what's the difference? Why is that a big deal? Well, when you go to your faucet and turn on your water, you're going to get fresh, clean water when you're in a power outage situation. In a grid down situation, you can't rely on that, because there are electronic devices, electronic pumps, all of this that rely on the power grid to keep the water flowing and clean. So one must assume right away that you're going to have water issues if there is a grid down situation. So number one priority is you've got to find a way to collect water in case the water's not pumping, and you need to have a way to purify the water in case the water is pumping, but it is pumping impure river water to your faucet. So that's some things that people don't think about. Well, in an EMP situation, your car would not work. But in a grid down scenario, your car would work, as long as you had gasoline. Once again, the pumps that you go and hook your car up to and fill your car up with, those pumps are electric. Without electricity, there will be no pumping of gasoline. So whatever gasoline you have on hand is the gasoline you will have. This is true of anything. This is true of propane, that they can't even pump the big propane pumps because they're electrically powered. Now, the propane that's in the tank trucks would run in a grid down situation because they're running off the 12-volt power supply coming from the truck itself. So, in a grid down scenario, you could charge your electronics using your car as a generator. So you could still have if you had the right inverters, you could still run your whole house pretty much off a car, because until the generator failed, until you just overloaded it. But it can take a lot. I routinely, on rainy days in my off-grid cabin, use my Toyota Corolla and jumper cables to power up my 12-volt batteries so that I can continue having my rainy day movie day, even though there's no electricity being produced for my batteries. And so I just do a hookup and a recharge in the rain. So, but I don't know how much you could do that to a car's alternator before it started to overload and fry. But you would have the advantage of your vehicle running in the event of a grid down versus an EMP. But your vehicle would not, wouldn't be able to power your whole house. And sooner or later, you're going to run out of gas, and they can't pump any more gas. Now, can you get the gas? Could someone get the gas out of the ground and start distributing it? Yeah, you could. I mean, honestly, you could roll up on a gas station, and if there wasn't an armed man there stopping you, I think you could probably pop the lid where they fill the gas up from the trucks. You've seen the trucks all parked out there filling up into the manhole. Ultimately, one could probably pop that, drop a jackrabbit pump down there, and just pump your own gasoline out, and unless someone was tough enough to stop you. So there's going to be some gas. There's going to be some black market selling of gas in the event of a grid down scenario. But ultimately, for the most part, you're going to have the gas you have on hand. So in prepping for a grid down scenario, it might behoove you to put up several gallons of gasoline as backup. So you could use your car for a generator, or basically to get the heck out if things get weird. Now, we've talked about the likelihood, or the possibilities rather. What's the likelihood of an EMP or a grid down event? Well, just recently, we had a full grid down event in South America, where 4 South American countries went black. They went completely dark. And all of Argentina, all of Uruguay, and part of Paraguay, and part of Brazil, I think, were part of this multinational blackout that happened in Central America, or in South America rather. And then you also have the grid went down in not Argentina, not Brazil, Venezuela. Venezuela had a grid down event that occurred. And some are saying that we have been causing short grid down events in areas of Russia where we've been pushing this cyber attack. Trump says it's not true. He may not know. It may be true and he may not know it. But because they don't keep the president in the loop on everything. Come on. But what would it be like if we had a civil war? You know, there's a lot of talk about civil war in America. You know, the left rising up against the right. I was just talking about how the deep state may be doing things and keeping Donald Trump out of the loop. So there's this definite disruption and division in our government between certain elements we call the deep state and the presidency of Donald Trump. And kind of caught in the middle is the military. So I recently saw a very well-made video concerning what a civil war would look like. And it was based on the findings from a United States government inquiry. Okay, so they put together this group, and they do this routinely, called a red team event, or a red team planner. So if you're a red team planner, what that means is you work for the government, and the government comes to you and says, okay, if you were going to do such and such, how would you do it? So they literally put a team of thinkers, of planners, of tacticians together to, for instance, see what a civil war would look like. And so they did this, and they took the deep state and law enforcement, and they aligned them with the elite leftists. Okay, so Hollywood and the corporations, all of those against the run-of-the-mill Second Amendment, grassroots, right-wing American patriot. Okay, that was the scenario. The millions of gun owners in America versus the deep state and the elite leftists. In this scenario planning, the very first thing they came to was, in the event of a civil war, the grid's going to go down. The grid's just going to go down. The government's not going to do it, because ultimately a grid down scenario would hurt people living in the city, all of the technocratic companies, all of the corporations, and the United States government. It would actually hurt the U.S. government if the grid went down. In fact, it would probably hurt them more than it would hurt you, because if you're like the average patriot, you've got some preps set aside. You've been planning for such a thing. And you may even have alternate ways of creating electricity besides your car's generator. You may own a generator or an RV with a generator, or you may have a solar panel system already attached to your house. These people will not feel the event as firmly as people who are not prepared, people who live in the city, and the United States government will be ironically somewhat crippled by this. And you're like, well, they have generators. Well, they do, assuming their generators and their backup generators all function properly. But they would be affected nearly as badly as we would be. Well, probably more so in the fact that we could still function where whole areas of the government would cease to be functioning. And even the military itself, although it's pretty well insulated against an EMP, the grid down, that still relies on the grid. I mean, they would probably, the government, in the event of a grid down, probably would stop fighting the patriots, and they would turn around and put all of their efforts towards reestablishing power for their own uses. So, in this red planning event, this leaked information coming from a red planner, that number one priority by anybody who's trying to overthrow the government or cause chaos is to take down the power grid. It's so simple. Like I said earlier in this video, 20 deer hunters who knew where to position themselves could take out the power grid like that. Cyber attacks coming from inside or outside the nation could take down the power grid like that. So, as a prepper, as a patriot, as an American who likes to be prepared for anything, I think it would be foolish for us not to make our number one main priority preparing for a power grid failure. It's not a matter of if the power grid will fail. It's only a matter of when will the power grid fail, how bad will the failure be, and how long will it take to restore power, and what kind of chaos would ensue in the period of time it takes to restore power. This is definitely a tool in the toolbox of our enemies. This is definitely a tool in the toolbox of anyone thinking about overthrowing the government. This is definitely a tool in the toolbox of anyone who's trying to create chaos in our country. There's a lot of people that want to create chaos in our country. There's people besides the patriots that would like to see a reset in this country. There are people on the left who just want to tear it all down, and taking down the power grid would do that for them real good. They would love that. They'd want to do that just to see us all fail, see us all in trouble, see us all hungry, see us all cold. So it's not a matter of if there's going to be a power grid failure. It's just a matter of when, how bad it is, and how long it will last. So I would say you should put together a solar power system and don't worry about EMPs. I don't think an EMP is going to happen because an EMP is devastating against everyone, but most devastating against the American people. If a foreign government were to attack us with an EMP, it wouldn't slow the government down so much as it would destroy the American people's ability to survive from day to day. It would be a disaster of gargantuan proportions. But a grid down scenario would probably hurt the government more than it hurt the people, because people can still create some electricity. They could still have their vehicles if they could find a way to get gas. And so grid down is more survivable. Therefore, grid down is probably step one in any kind of fight that involves the United States soil. So whether it's an invading army, whether it's a terrorist attack, or whether it's the beginning step of civil war in the United States, power grid failure is going to happen. It's just a matter of when. So have a way of creating electricity. Have some solar panels, have some wind turbines, at least keep a couple of deep cycle 12-volt batteries charged up. If they're fully charged, a couple of those would last you about a week if you're just using it to run basic communications and, laptop recharging and phone recharging and that sort of thing. It would last you at least a week, if not two, if you were studious. So even if you can't afford a giant solar-powered system or a wind turbine, at least invest in a whole lot of batteries, because that would put it off for a little while and give you some connection to the outside world. Any kind of device that runs on solar power would continue to work in a grid down. Hand crank generators, that sort of thing. Gasoline generators would continue to work as long as you had gasoline. So as important it is to put up food and water, it's also important to prepare for the inevitable. Because the grid down scenario would first have you dealing with no power, and secondly, you would have to be dealing with how to make sure your water is good and that you have a flow of water. And then the third thing would be, okay, so how do we get gasoline to continue to power our vehicles and our generators? And also, how do we get food and water, since trucking companies would be crippled by a grid down because they're unable to pump diesel for those giant trucks that deliver the food and distribute the food and goods around our country. So it would bring the trucking system to a halt. All of this could create starvation. So, food preparation and food storage is extremely important, as is water storage. But also have a way to create electricity so that you could still keep in contact, keep, your communications up and going, keep your lights on, and that sort of thing. But also, you're going to need alternative heating because, if you have an electric furnace, you can't create enough electricity in a solar panel system to run electric heat. You've got to have some other fuel source. So wood-burning fireplace if you live in the extreme north, especially if you live where wood is plentiful. Propane is a temporary solution, but ultimately your propane would have to be refilled by a truck that can't get diesel because they can't pump it out of the ground. You see the problems. You see why a grid down scenario might be the exact perfect first step in any new 21st century war. If you're going to attack a country, take out their power grid first. That seems to be the new reality. So it's a reality that we should all prepare for, because we do not have the ability to protect our power grids right now. Our power grid in the United States is vulnerable. It's wide open, and it's just a matter of time till someone exploits that to their benefit and to the detriment of the American people. All right, so till next time, God save our republic.